we know we won't immediately at my background this morning and go, where is he? That doesn't look like the normal kind of trash house we see. This is Rachel's workspace. She spends most of her time on Zoom meetings or Microsoft Teams or whatever particular thing she's using. So the first thing we did when we moved into this house was the first thing she did was put some effort into thinking about her workspace and what it looks like for everybody else. So that's why this room looks fabulous. But there's no carpet on the floor, and looking this way, it doesn't look anything like looking that way. Next week we have Lee Greenwood with us. Many of you will know Lee, and she'll do a great job as she looks at the next thing. Now, I did look at what the subject was, but I've forgotten. Today I get to look at contemplation. Great. Contemplation. In fact, when I saw that I was on the list for this, I went to Simon and said, have you got the right person for this? And he said, yes, I'm sure I have. Now, when it comes to contemplation, it seems to me that there's two broad types of contemplation, or two broad types of resources for contemplative prayer. And that is contemplative prayer for introverts and contemplative prayer for extroverts. And actually, when you look at the resources, that most of them seem to land in the introvert category, and they don't tend to land in the extrovert category. So as we get into thinking of this, I've got a little exercise for you to do, and that is to type your definition of contemplation, not contemplative prayer, but just what the word contemplation means, into the chat box, and we'll pick up that in a minute. So if while I'm talking you'd like to think contemplation, what does that mean, and then type your answer into the chat box, that will be great. So let's think for a moment about contemplation for introverts. I won't spend long on this because it doesn't really apply to me, because when I do those kind of personality type things, I lean into the extrovert part of the continuum. This resources around this tend to lean on the contemplative tradition. We've got a posh name in theology for that, and we call it the apophatic tradition, just in case you were wondering. But if you watch the prayer course video this week, that's the tradition that Pete Greig is drawing from as he speaks. In fact, Pete's video touches on the point that Ian made, drawing from last week as he led us in prayer earlier, and that was that we can be part of the answers to our prayers. And Pete Greig, points to Mother Teresa of Calcutta and the impact that she has from a contemplative tradition. Now, contemplation for introverts provides tools, or extols the virtue of tools like silence, looking at art and pictures, icons, perhaps religious art particularly, and so that you can study and reflect on every part. It concentrates on things like immersing yourself in nature and seeing what God has to say through the natural world around us. Now, I did see if my friend Molly Boot was around today, because she has a particular interest and emphasis on this, and she would be great. I'm going to share my screen with you. But goodness knows how to do that when you're in a hurry. I'll come back to that in a minute. She wasn't available, unfortunately. She's preaching at a church in Bethnal Green, and they do live sermons like us, so she wasn't around. But she thinks this tradition is kind of radical and amazing, and she's writing a book to prove it. You can look her up if you want, or follow her on Twitter. She's at MollyBoot1. And when her book comes out, that's something that I will remind you of when it comes out, because she'll have lots of helpful things to say about that. So when it comes to this morning and dealing with contemplation, I'm going to let you into a little window in my brain, which I will open up, and you can see how I deal with the constant stream of activity that is up there. I've had tinnitus for most of my life, particularly worsened after 5 years of working at McDonald's. And silence to me, just isn't beauty, but a form of torture. So, particularly when we're in prayer meetings and there's silent times, I have a series of techniques that I use to get, create noise in my head, so that I've got something else to think about other than ringing in my noise in my ears. In fact, I was in a fairly contemplative prayer meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the great thing about Zoom is it's dead easy. Just mute your microphone and put Spotify on, and you can have a soundscape there to accompany you. I forgot to pause Spotify when I went back into the dialogue part of the music, and somebody said, "Where is that music coming from? It's ever so loud." It's just me coping. So I'm going to be telling you about how I found space to be reflective and contemplative in a prayerful way, without feeling guilty about not liking silence and always needing some form of soundscape around me in order to distract me from the ringing in my ears. Part of it is how I coped with my need to be around people. Some people love to go on retreats. Those things terrify me because of all the quiet and space that you're given. So I have a particular perspective on this. So let's have a look at your different views of what contemplation means, and Ruth is going to read those back for us. Thanks, Ruth.
So the first one is having to sit still, pondering, reflecting on an action plan, taking a step back and a fresh look, reflective and considered, staying with a thought or feeling for a while rather than following the distractions, dwelling thoughtfully on something for a while, having time to reflect deeply on something and seek God's wisdom, to reflect, thinking and mulling over something, pondering. Contemplation for me is thinking more deeply about something for an extended length of time, thinking about something at length, often including how you feel about it, considering the world in a mindful way, looking deep within and how things connect to the world outside you. And contemplation for me is slowing down to look beyond the surface of things.
Lovely. Thank you very much for those insights. And of course, when you look at the dictionary, there's two definitions for contemplation: the act of thinking deeply and the act of looking at something from a calm and careful way. So now we're going to turn to the scriptures and see how Jesus manages a little bit of contemplation in chaos. So I think Alistair's going to read that to us, and we've got John chapter 8. Thank you.
Okay. It's a woman caught in adultery. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. And as he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and Pharisees brought a woman they had caught in the act of adultery, and they put her in front of the crowd. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, stone her, but let those who have never sinned throw the first stones." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to her, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more."
Thank you. And here in this lovely passage, one of my favourites actually, we see the way in which Jesus approaches contemplation in a moment of high tension and stress. And I guess, for some of us, particularly if we're homeschooling at the moment, or there's other things going on in our house that we're not used to getting the kind of space that we need some models for being able to be thoughtful and contemplative in huge moments of stress. And one of the reasons I like this is because John's Gospel is particularly reflective. Out of all the 4 accounts we have of Jesus' life that we call the Gospels, John's Gospel takes a more a kind of slower approach, and you can see that there's it's not just relaying things that have happened, but he's put it together in a thoughtful and ponderous way. And here we get Jesus stopping. He's being putting under pressure all the time by these particular religious leaders. And there's all kinds of things that we can draw out of this story. But if we just allow our focus to rest for a moment on Jesus, what we see him doing is stopping, drawing in the sand, and then giving his answer. This is really interesting because when you read, something like one of the synoptic, the 3 Gospels that are very similar in storyline and approach, you have this kind of very active Jesus who's always doing and doing and doing and doing, and particularly in Mark's Gospel, when you read it, you get and immediately and immediately and immediately, and there's this kind of fast-paced element to it. And we tend to think about Jesus as this person that when he needed to pray, he climbed up the hillside to hide from everybody. But actually in John's Gospel, we see Jesus being able to pause in the middle of it. And he uses this technique of scribbling in the sand to find the space he needs just to be able to think and ponder over his immediate answer. So when it comes to thinking about God and thinking deeply and calmly and carefully, I use a particular process. It's an approach, if you like, to being able to think about this. And it comes to me in a series of questions, because that's how my mind particularly likes to work. So I'm just going to pop my screen up here, and I'll share this process with you and talk you through it as I go. But here is Molly, just in case you want to have a look there. So the first thing I tend to think about here is, what is the subject or issue that I need to think about or I want to ponder over? I'm not one for kind of saying, right, God, what do you want to say to me? And being able to allow that just to come to me. Because my mind is so active, it's quite difficult to be able to start from that space. So I always start with a particular subject and issue, and I'm always thinking about stuff. So this isn't too hard for me to do. Rachel and I, over the past few years, but particularly over one concentrated period of time, went through this process in thinking about God's place in natural disasters and complex humanitarian situations, like somewhere like Yemen, where there's multiple factors involved in what's happening there. And I've used this process to think about personal issues, perhaps particularly coercive control, and to help me analyze and reflect in a godly, prayerful, theological way about those issues that I've experienced. And so once I've identified the thing that I'm going to allow God to speak to me about, I go through this process. I begin to say, what do I think about the subject? What's my starting place? What's my experience? And so if you're thinking about a personal subject, like say you've had the experience of having to lead your organization through a restructuring and making many people redundant, and you want to think about that in a kind of what does God have to say to me about this? I know that I have to do this work, but what's the process? Or perhaps there's a particular pattern of relationship in your life that you've recognized keeps happening again and again and again, and you want to think about that. Or whatever it is, maybe you want to think about suffering and why there is suffering in the world and what's God's response to that. One of the bigger more issues of life that we often allude to and refer to in church life. So I begin to say, this is my starting place. And I just pause there for a moment because I've loaded my notes up and I put them in a nice order so that I could follow them with plenty of white space. But unfortunately for me, the computer's renamed all the points number 1. So it's kind of difficult for me to spot where I am in my notes. So I'm going to put them down for a moment and just concentrate on my PowerPoint, and hopefully that will keep us going in a nice smooth direction. Then I begin to ask myself this question: what do I already know about God that can help me in my thinking here? So what does my Christian experience bring to bear on the subject? Where have the different sermons and books that I've read and Bible passages that I've studied come into this? What are the things that immediately come to mind? So in this part of the process, I'm asking myself questions about me, about the setting, about the contemplation that I want to go through, and about what I already know about God. So I'm drawing from within at this point in the process. And then I begin to work out what that means. Let me say for a moment, how do I personally do this? I tend to be somebody who will write stuff down. I quite like brainstorming. We've painted one of our doors black with chalkboard paint downstairs, and one of the reasons is that for doing notes, but also for a whiteboard is kind of fitting in an office but not in a home. So sometimes we will just chalk things on there while we try and work through our ideas and thought processes. So that's the kind of thing that I will do. I'll do a little bit of a mind map, sometimes called a brainstorm. Sometimes I'll just take these ideas and go for a walk and think about them while I'm stretching my legs and walking. There's almost certainly going to be, if I've sat down and doing something, some music in the background. I have particular styles of music that help me to think, and I've tried white noise and stuff like that, but just find it annoying. So I tend to do something like Ludovico in the background, where nice and low will just help me facilitate my thinking. And as I do this, I begin to say, what kind of kinesthetic activity might help me or offer some new perspective to this? So I start drawing at this moment from outside resources. I've started from within myself, and then I start looking elsewhere for those resources. What can offer a new perspective? So for me, I find sitting at my desk isn't necessarily the best way to think about these, though I am a writer in terms of these things as doing stuff. So renovating a house has been really good for me as I've got into Chapel A church life, and it gives me an opportunity to pause and to reflect on the issues that are going around there. Doing something with my hands gives my brain the space to think through other things. So actually having stuff, going on here is a really important part of my own reflective process. And then one of the questions I like to ask myself is, can art help? So are there particular musicians or musical styles that might bring a new perspective to this? Are there subjects that have people have done and reflected on where they've used art to bring out something, some understanding of the setting? So when I was thinking about coercive control as an example, there's some really interesting and helpful pictures about how different people have perceived that. I'm not an artist in that sense myself. I'm the best thing I can kind of draw is a stick man. So I don't contemplate using that method, though some of you might find that really a helpful thing to do. But drawing on other people's things, and particularly when we're talking about theological themes that people have spent decades and generation upon generation, like suffering, those things do have quite a number of kind of artistic backgrounds and stuff going on there. So there's quite a lot of resource that you can use to help you think it through. And then I start to say, what other perspectives might help me at this point develop my own understanding? So I'm in a research phase, if you like. I've stopped drawing on myself, but I've started adding other things to that reflection and contemplation. So other theologians might have something to say, some theological perspectives. Perhaps there's something from the world of psychology that might help, or some other academic discipline that might help me think about and reflect upon and ponder this issue. Perhaps there's something in other religions or other approaches to spirituality that can be helpful. And so as I use those different things to kind of influence and put into the thing that I've begun to think about, I start to enter a more learning phase. And I ask myself the question, so from these different inputs that I've had, what have I learned about God, and how has my thinking about God changed? It particularly sits opposite that, what do I already know about God that can help my thinking? I'm now saying, what am I learning about God that's pushing me into a new direction? And that leads me on to, what might I do to act differently? So that might be in the way that I help people. If I've been looking at suffering as the example I've used throughout this sermon as an example, what's my reflections happened, so that when I'm talking to somebody who's going through a period of difficulty or struggle or some form of suffering, what might I bring to that table from this process of contemplation? What might I do if I find myself in a situation of coercive control again? How might I respond to that? What might be different in the future? And that kind of ricochets me off, not necessarily back round the circle, but more in a kind of inward going spiral, or a time-wise spiral that takes me on and beyond where I am. So this is the process of contemplation that I personally use in my approach and all the things that I do. Let's just take a moment to pause and to collect our thoughts and give them to God as Helen begins to bring the breakout rooms to a close. Father, thank you for the traditions that help us think through these issues, or give us the tools to think through and to contemplate issues. And we pray that as we continue to think about prayer, you will lead and guide us.